How good it is to give thanks to you, O Lord, to sing in your honor, O Most High God, to proclaim your constant love every morning and your faithfulness every night. Amen. Okay, now we're getting into the part of the missionary journeys of Paul and associates. And as we do this the next couple of weeks, they're going to have us read not only what's happening on those journeys, but a few times the missives that come out. So next week, we'll be reading about the time in Corinth, but also the letters to the Corinthians, etc. And that'll happen the next couple of weeks, because I don't know if you realize we have about 3 more weeks left, 29, 30, and 31. So we are kind of winding down here, which means if we want to go back to any material, we have that renewed chance every week. But let me start with my, again, I don't know if this is a helpful way to start, but what is going on for you as you read this week or as you heard the video, congruence or dissonance, either one. And I'd like to invite Herb to start our time together, if I might.
Well, here we see Paul on his second missionary journey. It begins, I guess, with disagreement with Barnabas about whether they should take Mark or not, and so they split ways. The letter to the Philippians is kind of interesting. At the same time he's praising them, but he's just reminding them to be humble, not to grumble. Don't worry about depending on things of the flesh. So I think there's just a lot there to first of all to learn from in those first 4 chapters of Philippians, or the first 4 chapters of Philippians, about how to live our lives. So I will defer to Darlene.
One of the things that really struck me is the conflict between Barnabas and Paul. And I like the way that they agreed to disagree and go separate ways, because that wasn't working, or because they had different ideas of what they should be doing, and who knows what else they were angry about. But I like the fact that the statement made that God used that to further the mission. And I also like the concept of they reconcile later. And so to me, that's a good model for us. Us as individuals, but also us as a church, that there'll be disagreements, and but there's reconciliation. The ability to reconcile is within us, within the church and the individuals. So that, to me, that's encouraging. That human nature, it happened then and it happens now, and we can go on with God's mission. Ellen.
Thank you, Darlene. I guess what I liked most about this was the fact that it emphasized that in all the terrible things that happened to them, they were joyful, like the illustration of Paul in prison singing. And I think, my gosh, what strong faith. I also liked the illustration of where he healed the psychic and then got in trouble because he took away the earnings that the owners, I guess it was, had. And it's kind of like, well, no good deed goes unpunished, I guess. And you can't, to me, what that meant and what it said to me was, you do what you think is right, and you don't worry about the outcome. That's left up to God, and we just do our part. And I guess those were the main points that I got. Tim, are you there?
I am here. Yes, I'm here.
Great to see you.
I guess the we've read these before, but I guess the thing that strikes me is when we think about places like Philippi a couple thousand years ago, they were a fairly sophisticated society back then. And I guess that came through to me here. That we weren't talking about to a bunch of Aborigines or anything else, or people that just came out of the woods. And the speaker spoke about how Philippi came about, from Philip II. So I guess that just kind of reinforces to me how powerful the word of Jesus is, that it can infiltrate such a sophisticated community. John?
I found that the readings this week had a lot of I don't know how to describe this exactly, but it appeared to me that, anyway, I'm sorry. One of the things that did stand out to me was when Paul went to Athens to speak with the leaders of Athens. And one of the things that they made note of was that Athens at the time was a democratic society. And I'm going to read this. He goes on to say, today's tourists see majestic ruins of this 2,400-year-old temple to Athena, but Paul saw it glistening in all its architectural wonder. Athens, city of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, was proud not only of its centuries of philosophic debate, but also its tradition of democracy. However, that democracy was limited to citizens, highborn, the educated, the property holders. Most of the population were slaves. And my first thought was, isn't that pretty much the way it is today, right here? So, I mean, there's so many more things, but I'll leave it at that.
John, that's a very good observation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, we often use the word democracy, unfortunately, because we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And they were a republic too, but a republic of the few, right? Republic of landowning men who had votes, right?
Well, I guess my point, Mike, is that if you really look at it, the people who can vote today, not that everyone isn't allowed to vote, but there are people today who are, I wouldn't call them slaves necessarily, they're not, but at the same time, because of, for instance, the work that they do or their hours, that limits their ability to vote. So the people who can vote are the people who are we'll say higher socioeconomic class of citizens.
Yeah, I think that's fair without being, without getting fair enough.
Mike, it's not political. That's not my
point. No. I don't perceive you're saying that at all. No, and I think it's fair to just acknowledge, right, when we talk about, like, as a former statistician, right, when you go to about compile statistics, it's like there's no perfect study. So if you're going to do a census, how do you count people who are homeless? How do you count people who have changed their address? How do you count people who are in college? And then you're relying on self-reporting, right? So if somebody says, I have a green card, then that's what they said. But how do you fact check a census, right? So this is like what we live in.
I have one more question.
Please.
Just really a question. In there, it said that Dionysius, a distinguished member of the judicial court, became a believer. Tradition says he was the first bishop of Athens. Who would have been who have made him the bishop? Who was his apostolic successor?
This predates apostolic succession. When you hear the word bishop, you're hearing the word overseer. Overseer for like 20 people. So the scale is so different. And what does an overseer mean? We're not totally sure. Does it mean they were an administrator? Does it mean they were the preacher? I mean, it's a little bit, murky, quite honestly. But like, when you read this, you're really thinking about like little house, like little church plants, like little ones. I mean, the congregation at St. Thomas would be much larger than any of these. Just keep that in mind. And there's no public meetings. There's no public meetings.
Did they tend to be families that gathered, families of believers that gathered together?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And like what you'll see sometimes is like the jailer will come and then his whole family will be baptized. And that's because like the head of the house makes a decision and the whole house is swept in. So families, yeah, that seems right. And the primary people who are interested, please notice, are not actually Jewish people. They're Greek people interested in Judaism. But Jewish culture was such a challenge to Greek culture because of circumcision and modesty, just to name a few, right? Which would have put you at odds with Greek culture, that it was like a tough thing for people to cross. And, you know, what you see as you read this is like the expansion, not into the Jewish crowd, but more into this like, Hellenistic crowd. These are like Greek people interested in Judaism. And it's funny, like there's a lot of tension in the story. So like Paul says, you don't need to be circumcised, but he circumcises Timothy. And he excoriates the Philippians for thinking about circumcision, but he circumcised Timothy.
Mike, did he do that because Timothy's mother was Jewish? Or he just did it?
Maybe, but keep in mind that at this time, Judaism wasn't matriarchal. That happened like in the 10th century AD, that shift. This was very much a patriarchal descent. Case in point, look at the genealogies in the Bible. They're all three men, they're not three women, including Jesus, right? I mean, it's the line of Joseph that gets traced, not the line of Mary.
I don't know where I read it, but I did read it during this week. It mentioned something, maybe this is today, that if your mother is Jewish, you can, I guess, become, or you can be a Jew by virtue of the fact that your mother's Jewish. But if your father's Jewish, that's not the case.
That's right. Judaism is now, again, for the last 1,000 years, is matrilineal. And I don't know if you noticed, I will just share with you, I asked, when I told the rabbi, conservative rabbi Federo, that my brother was Jewish, he was like, ugh, he converted? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, ugh, like put off by that. And I think part of it is like, why would you want to be Jewish? We have to do things different. Like, you know, what he said at the end is like, you know, like anybody can worship God however they want and have their own prayers, but we have to do it this way. And so I think like the response is like absolutely not evangelical. Like we were born into this way and we have to do it. Why would anybody want to do it like this? I don't know how long it's been like that, but I would tell you like part of the attraction in the ancient world is that Judaism, at least Pharisaical Judaism, as opposed to the Sadduceical Judaism, had an everyday ethic. So, you know, like in general, religion was practiced at temples on festival days. That was it. But Judaism had a moral code and people wanted that. The other thing that happens in the early church, right, is that people are converted around experiences of power, like speaking in tongues and healing. And look, we've really distanced ourselves from that. Like, we're very skeptical, but that was why the early church, there was attraction as people saw things happening. I mean, that's why you hear about all these miracles, deeds of power. And so this had a lot of traction for people. Keep in mind that there's like the oracle at Delphi, and there's these cults of Isis and like Asclepius or Serapion, the snakes around the pole. Those are like places you go for healing. But look, like Christian people are doing that. So like maybe they've got more power than these other deities. So that's part of what's operating here. But there is this, again, this weird tension about why would you circumcise Timothy? Maybe you can say it's practical because but he doesn't, for example, he doesn't circumcise like Titus, and that's going to get him in trouble later. You'll notice Titus walks into the temple uncircumcised and he's going to get in trouble. So like, why did you do this one and not that one? And there's another weird thing, because Ellen mentioned the girl who predicts the future. Did you notice Paul does that because he's annoyed with her? Not because he wants her to be liberated. He's just like, leave me alone. And that's weird. It's not like he had her best interest in mind. He just was tired of her following him.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Something I'm not quite sure I understand. You say Titus goes into the temple and he's uncircumcised. How do you know that he's uncircumcised if he has clothes on?
Good question. Well, let's discuss that in 2 weeks when we read it. Is that okay? I don't want to put you off, but keep in mind, like, underwear wasn't what it now is, right?
Yeah, I understand.
Beyond that, there's the rumor itself, and keep in mind, this is a culture that has public bathhouses. If you're somewhat Greek, right, which Hellenist Christians would have been into, and that would have made instant tension. You roll into a Greek bathhouse circumcised, and it's like, oh, mutilator of the flesh, like, what's your problem? But there was also expectation, kind of like business deals were made on golf courses 30 years ago. It was sort of like that. Business was done in bathhouses.
Yeah, there was gymnasiums and bathhouses that the Greeks always were naked in, and it kind of offended the Jews. But if you attended a bathhouse or gym, they knew if you were Jewish or not. So.
Now, I do want to remind you that Hebrews were not the only people circumcising. This was a practice in the land of Canaan. Egyptians did it as well. It's just that Hebrews did cut more of the foreskin off. That's true. Darlene.
I was taught that, or I heard that the reason Timothy was circumcised so that he would not be a stumbling block to the Jews when they went to evangelize them. But your statement about Titus, I mean, that just kind of blows that. That scripture or that episode was used to teach us that we shouldn't be a stumbling block to others, that we should avoid things that would be offensive to others as we were evangelizing. So I don't know. I think that was a way of twisting scripture to try to keep us in line.
Well, and I think it's tough, again, because Paul talks out of both sides of his mouth.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, I've heard this scripture too that said, like, well, you shouldn't go around doing anything that's culturally offensive, which means like women shouldn't teach in public and men shouldn't have earrings and you have to dress conservatively. But like the whole message of the gospel is, no, you don't.
Yeah.
And so like Paul in some ways undermines his own teaching, and let's just be honest. But I think the truth is, I'm not trying to take the guy to task, except to say we all do that. We all say, like, I've got this general principle and I understand, like, I have to run a business. So like, how am I going to do that? And I think it's a fair tension. Like, I think like consideration for others is important, but at the loss of yourself, not so much. And like, how do we navigate that? You know, like for a long time, if you did find yourself like homosexual and you wanted to be a cleric, you had to pick between the two. And, you know, I'm grateful that at least in our church, you don't have to make that choice anymore, because that seems like a really tough choice. You know, now granted, like, unfortunately, this isn't me, but like if I wanted to have like a 6-inch long spiked red mohawk, I mean, I probably could do that. But it might be hard, you know, people might be like, I don't know, man, you know, so like I've made some of my own choices and they do turn people off. And I can't apologize that for anymore, because I made those choices. I knew that could happen, you know, and I don't feel like I need to go necessarily any further. So, you know, like I just think this is practical stuff. But I think what we all know is like, if you try to please everyone, first of all, you won't please anyone, especially yourself. So like we have to sort of figure some of that out.
Hey, Mike.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned a little earlier about some of the miracles that were happening, like speaking in tongues,
yeah,
those kinds of things. And I'm assuming that the miracles ended with somewhere towards the end of the Bible period. So, I mean, I guess I don't understand how they kind of ended and we just carried on.
Well, I mean, depending who you talk to, they haven't ended. I mean, people go to Lourdes every year, right? And you know, the Roman Church canonizes saints, but that's not just like unique to the Roman Church. Like as a Southern Baptist, like we would pray for people who had appendicitis and they'd get better without having an appendectomy. Okay. Now, how do we really know? And I think like when we read the scriptures, we have this like understanding that like there was like light coming from people's fingers. And I think that's just because that's our imagination. You know, like I just can't imagine that there was like an epoch of miracle working that's gone, because I just didn't think God works that way, just myself. Sometimes I think we read these miracle language and forgive me, this is how I deal with it. Like sometimes I think these are describing qualities more than quantities. I mean, but I have to give some tension. Like, do people really get healed by Benny Hinn and like go in a wheelchair and walk home? I mean, I don't know. It happens on the TV screen. I'm skeptical. And yet I do also know that there's people who have like stage 4 cancer and then they go back a month later and they don't have any. And maybe this first scan was bad. I don't know. But like you hear those stories. Maybe it's all psychosomatic. I mean, Tim, I don't know how to handle that. I mean, I think if I did, they wouldn't be miraculous. And you know what the philosopher David Hume says is that a miracle is anything that contravenes like logical outcomes. So frankly, there's a whole lot more miracles out there than we get credit for. But like, what's the criterion for the miraculous? I don't know what to say. I think that depends on everybody. And I pray for, I'm just going to tell you, I anoint people with oil and I pray for healing, but I don't think I'm working spells. Now, the person receiving it might think that, and they're open to that, but that's not in my head what I'm doing.
Okay. One other thing. Is there any place where we can learn about the growth of Christianity after the Bible ends?
Well, Herb probably knows the best answer to that. I mean, you can end up reading some of the early patristics. You can read documents like the Didache that talk about, you know, how it is the disciples thought you were supposed to practice certain things. There's not a lot of super solid evidence, Tim, about like what numbers look like, because Christians weren't important in the Roman Empire. This is a small percentage, right? So, I mean, you can read some of the extra canonical sources. You can listen to Bart Ehrman talk about like the growth of the early church through the great courses. But, you know, like the biggest moment you see ends up being like Constantine's conversion and legalization of Christianity in 313.
Well, I can understand with the fall of the Roman Empire and bishops began to take over the positions that the Romans had in the towns. I mean, I can understand that growth.
That happened before the fall of the Roman Empire. That happened at like some of the heights of territorial expansion.
Okay.
And part of it, we have to remember, they didn't have a court and police system like we do now. In fact, like modern policing is new. The reason you've heard of something called a citizen's arrest is because that's how we did it here for a long time. Like police forces that roamed, that like worked the beat. I mean, it's like less than 70 years old. That's hard to believe, but like it wasn't widespread policing like we now have until like 70-ish years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There were people like sheriffs and marshals, but think about those more as like, frankly, like home guard military. I don't mean there weren't police. I just mean it was very different from what we've grown up with, that there's a police force and there's patrol cars. You know, like if somebody wronged you in the ancient world, you got your neighbors to drag them to court, which was a jury of their peers anyway. They weren't necessarily paid positions, right? Or you went to a military person. And so like what Rome does is they use these bishops or they use pagan priests who have standing in their own community to help adjudicate complaints. And like the court, that's the way churches are shaped the way they are, is because they were like courthouses. That whole rail was like what you have in court to keep people away from the judge. We decided we'd use communion there, you know, but like it wasn't like Christians imagine the perfect building. That's what we were given.
Mike or
Yes, sir.
Folks, one of the things that I thought was interesting was that Paul, in his letters to the Philippians, one of the things about Philippi, and I think they said it in the talk before we started talking here, was that Philippi, as he said, was a Roman colony that had been, it said here anyway, Mark Antony had established it. But it was a mixture of cultures, Romans, Greeks, Stoic philosophers, Egyptian influences, and mystery societies. And I'm thinking, if you're going to want to start to grow a religion or a belief system, a good place to do it would be in a society that's got lots of different type people, lots of different thought systems. And that way, once they have, if you will, seen the light, then they could spread it out to to people in their groups, if you will. So anyway, it sounds that Philippi was a great place to try to really grow the Christian religion, or start its growth. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be like starting a place in a place like Houston or New York City, right? Population dense, the most like ethnically diverse city in America. That's us. Yeah. I do want to make sure I offer that starting in Luke, in Acts 16:11, this happens just episodically. There's this interesting word, which is first person plural, we. We sailed to Troas. So there's a shift from he did or they did to we did. That language is going to shift again in a couple of chapters. And so from the perspective of scholars, right, this is firsthand reporting from Luke. Like when Barnabas and Mark split, Luke hops on. And then Luke's going to hop off later and it'll go back to them, he, they. But there is a bit of we language here. And I just want to point that out because it's easily missed.
Yeah, I did notice that when I read that.
Yeah.
Caught me by surprise.
And that's just meant to be like the firsthand information, right? And so the rest of the time, Luke is reporting according to what other people have shared, but now this is firsthand, according to the text. And it's a visible seam in the narrative, right? So in some ways, it's interesting that he's compiling first and secondhand information.
Interesting.
I do want to point out a couple things we're not always sure about. In the ancient world, torture wasn't meant to extract information. Like if you went to jail, they just beat you up. And there was this understanding in the ancient world that you didn't torture to make people tell the truth. You tortured people first to bring them to the edge of living and death, and then they could tell the truth. So it wasn't like, I'll stop twisting the screw on your thumb if you tell me where the people are. It's, I'm just going to twist the screw on your thumb, and when I'm done, I'm sure you'll tell me the truth. It's a different understanding of torture. So people get beaten just like that's just regular. Like you get accused of a crime, I'm just going to frankly beat the hell out of you, and then you'll have to tell the truth because you've come to the edge of life and death. Again, when you hear about the people being beaten, that's the standard practice. We do get to read Philippians, and I think you've heard me say this to you before, but it's important just as a reminder that Philippians has what scholars would tell you is the oldest part of the New Testament, and that's a hymn. When you look at the text, depending on the translation of the Bible you've got, it may or may not be offset. The one I'm reading, which is the Revised Standard Version, it's not. It just appears like a regular old column. But the hymn is Philippians 2:5 to 2:11. Each of you should have, find among yourselves what you find in Christ Jesus. He was in the form of God, yet had no claim of equality with God, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. That's like a hymn or a poem that predates the content of Philippians. Every scholar would tell you that this is a hymn about Jesus and faith that maybe comes from the late 30s, maybe, and Philippians itself may be written in 55. Right, so it's like quoting the road less traveled by or something like that. Now we don't necessarily notice that, but again, scholars would tell you this is the oldest content of the New Testament. And I tell you this every week on Palm Sunday, but I won't be here to do it this year. This is one of those, unfortunately, there's not a book called 70 Greek words every Christian should know. But if there were, this would be one of them. And that word self-emptying, kenosis, is that word. Self-emptying, this is the Greek kenosis. Christ emptied himself. Is this understanding of the incarnation where God laid aside what we would consider power and authority on behalf of vulnerability and solidarity. And so that's like the key concept of the incarnation in the earliest Christian hymn. And it also is like an interesting ethic for us because Christ wasn't directed to empty. He wasn't forced to. He emptied himself. And so like this is like this really interesting tension we have between I'm doing this because my church tells me to, and I'm doing this because like I legitimately like choose to do it. I don't know if that makes sense. The self-emptying becomes really important when I think about the experience of women, because most women don't have the choice to empty themselves. They're culturally mandated to do that.
What do you mean emptying?
Well, okay, I think the best way to do it, if you've heard that Zen proverb, there's a student who wants to learn Zen. And the master says, okay, let me pour you this cup of tea. And so he takes the pot and starts pouring a cup up. And the cup is full and continues to fill the cup, and it's overflowing. And does it until the whole pot's empty. And the guy's like, no, like, why are you filling this out? And the master says, how can you make any room for Zen when you're already full of yourself?
How about a woman's definition of emptying self in terms of, like you were talking about, Mike, in culture. The concept that a woman is not a being unless she's relating to others. Mm-hmm. We are a mother, a wife, a sister, but we don't have a self-identity unless we relate to others. The concept of giving to others, no matter the cost to ourselves, always putting others first, always thinking about their safety, their feelings, their well-being. And we are the last, oftentimes not even the last, to take care of ourselves. So giving of others at the expense of ourselves. To me, that's the cultural expectation for women. And it's very difficult for women to, even with help and encouragement, to take care of their own needs. Because it doesn't feel legitimate. It doesn't feel like we have a right to do that. And I think,
yes,
there is some resentment from some people, but there's a genuine wanting to take care of others. But there's also the expectation, the cultural expectation. So that's a good thing about women, that we care about others so much, but it also has a price. We have a price to pay for that.
And Darlene, I almost wanted to say that there's this lovely image from Kabbalah about, in some ways, self-emptying, and it's applied to God. But the hard thing is it rests in a traditional metaphor that's like proscribed on women, which is that when God created the world like a pregnant woman, God made room inside of God's self for something to be different.
No.
And also sent nourishment to grow it. So it's a beautiful image, but the problem is that's also imposed on women because men can't do that, right? If men can't have pregnancies, and it sort of reaffirms that women are meant to have children. So it's a both and, right? Anytime we use this image, of course, it is true, men can't do that, and not all women choose to do that. Mm-hmm. Within or without a marriage, let's just be clear. Mm-hmm. And because women can doesn't mean they must or they should. And all of that's really, really difficult.
Right.
But I think that is a good image of self-emptying, is that you choose to make room for someone who is not you.
Yeah.
But some of that, but some of that is biological, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're also not defined by our biology, and increasingly like that's our hopefulness, right? If we were defined by our biology, we wouldn't have made this neocortex that makes us social beings that take care of our young. We'd still just live in the reptilian brain, right? So we are evolving to be in tension with some of our flight, fight, freeze responses. And we perceive that to be really good. The problem is sometimes we lose our mind and get all that mixed up. But hopefully what we do socially is we don't limit ourselves to biological hardware, because we don't have to.
I did a study recently on Miriam, and the sources that I looked at from the Jewish Women's Archives indicated that there's no scriptural notation of Miriam having a husband or children, and yet the patriarchal scholars attribute to her, I believe Hur was said to be her husband, and then somebody else said that was her child, and they gave her another husband. So she was not, my thinking is possibly she was not culturally appropriate, so the patriarchs assigned her a husband.
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because when you read Exodus, and we read it recently, right? We read that back in maybe October, when they crossed through the Sea of Reeds, there's this song, and mm-hmm. Moses sings a really long one. And then just a little bit later, Miriam sings a really short one. And every biblical scholar will tell you Miriam's was first.
Yes, the longer.
The longer one comes later, always. And it's put in Moses's mouth to diminish Miriam as the prophet.
Yes. Yes.
And that's something we struggle against. And I'm not, I think this is actually extremely germane when we not only talk about self-emptying, but the Philippian community. Look, it was funded by a woman. Lydia was the leader of it. Mm-hmm. It was with her money in her home. There's no reason to think Lydia was not the first bishop. She oversaw the community, and overseer doesn't mean she fried the chicken. This was her group of people, and she was wealthy. And she was a dealer in purple cloth. That's like being a gold and diamond dealer.
Mm-hmm. Well, unlike the Jews, it's interesting in these for just few chapters in Acts, you're seeing a lot of women come out. Lydia, Damaris,
Euodia, and Syntyche.
Yeah, exactly. And they're not mentioned in reference to their husbands either. I mean,
nope.
So now things may have gone up and down and changed over 2,000 years, but at least early in the Christian church, you see prominent women.
Well, and I think that's a really helpful thing. I just, I'm reading a book that Kathy Delgado recommended to me, and it might be interesting for you. By the way, I'm well over this issue, but if you're still interested in it, there's a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and it talks about ways in which one can read some of Paul's adjoinders against women that are very different. It also talks about women wielding power in the church in the Middle Ages and sort of in the early church as well. And what Herb mentioned, right, is you have these women who may or may not have been married, but their husbands are irrelevant. And you see this, that there's an apostle called Junia, that's definitely a woman. There's a deacon called Phoebe, right? So that's an order. And that Priscilla comes before her husband Aquila, which means she's more important. And so like there definitely are women leaders in the church. And like one of the ways I heard to read Euodia and Syntyche is that they're gossiping busybody women, and Paul's putting them in their place. They're presbyters. They're leaders in the community, and they're disagreeing. And what's interesting, Darlene mentioned, is like, hey, disagreements happen. Like Paul disagrees with Barnabas. And by the way, Paul is clearly the one who's wrong because Mark writes the Gospel of Mark. So men disagree all the time, go their different ways. And here are two women who are disagreeing. And Paul is saying, y'all need to figure it out. Oh, maybe it's because Paul wished he'd figured it out with Mark. Maybe he's saying, hey, I wish I hadn't departed, so I hope you don't do my mistake. There's no reason we can't read it that way. But these aren't women who are arguing over whether to have sweet or iced tea at a reception after church. These are the leaders of the church. Both of them pillars. That's been really obscured. And I don't know what tradition you grew up in, but in some ways it doesn't matter, because I can't really think of a church that's not saturated. This is going to sound bold when I say it, that's not saturated in misogyny. I can't think of a single one, whether it's Roman or Protestant or Episcopalian. Like we're saturated in it, and it's not biblical. Part of what the book I read that's really interesting, and I'm still in it, right? The Making of Biblical Womanhood, is that what happens is the patriarchy of culture gets imposed onto the Christian movement, but the early Christian movement is trying to say, don't be like the patriarchy of culture. In Christ, there's neither male nor female. That is to say, don't give special priority according to gender. There's neither slave nor free. Don't give masters more vote than you give slaves. This is this fundamental equity the scriptures uphold that we could say we make room for theologically, but we don't practice politically. We don't. And it hasn't been practiced in church, case in point. Like, women aren't allowed to teach boys older than 13 in most churches. Now, look, that's not the Episcopal Church, but I just want to point out we still struggle with this, right? Because like, I'm Father Mike, but what do you call a female cleric? Mother Jenny. Mother and father are not equal in your household, like, and so like we can do what we want. but the words are anchored and they have different power relationships. And we all know that, right? Until like the early 70s, women couldn't have credit cards. So that's like relatively new. John?
Do you think, and I pose this to everyone, that as Homo sapiens, we are fairly early in our evolution? And I say that for this reason. If you look back at human history, the difference between men and women, men being physically stronger than women, and women.
I gotta pause you. We can't even make a claim like that. I don't know most men that have the strength to have a baby.
That's not what I'm talking about.
But because you said physically stronger, I think it's important to call out it's a different kind of strength. And our language is saturated with it. John, I'm not saying you're bad. I mean, our language is saturated so that we say things like that. But what we don't realize is there is like just even biological difference. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying I found myself like, can men in general do more pull-ups than women? Yes. But it's a different kind of strength. That's all. Sorry.
Let's hear him out.
My point was strictly physical strength.
Yeah.
And that was very important in the early development of man up until a point. Now, if you look at today, it's less important because, frankly, of technology and what have you. And frankly, what the strength is more of in your head than it is the need for physical strength today.
Yeah.
And so what I'm wondering is, as we move forward as Homo sapiens, that difference between men and women is going to be less and less because the technology, if you will, of man, of people have reduced the impact of physical strength to much more of a mental strength impact. And so if you look out, I don't know, 10,000 years, perhaps at that point, there will be equality, true equality between men and women. Just a thought.
I think that's hopeful, John. I think our brains are still in that arrested development where we have the same reaction between a lion and a criticism. And I could tell you that if somebody wanted me to do something and they were, let's say, Stephen Hawking, or I don't know who to pick, Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'm an embodied person, and probably the stronger looking body is going to get more attention in a situation like that. And I think I just consider, right, that like kids naturally gravitate more to professional football players than they do to intellectuals. And that's not because culture's dumb or whatever, it's because we're embodied. And there's like this physical strength thing that goes on. So I'm hopeful, John, that we might change. And maybe the scriptures remind us the way we do that is by emptying ourselves.
Well, one of the reasons true. One of the reasons that I mentioned this is that if you look, just a small piece of argument for what I just mentioned is that when I started at Virginia Tech in 1976, there were few women in the curriculum. There might have been, out of 140, there might have been 30 or so. Today, it's probably, if not 50-50, there are probably more women in the program than there are men. Now, that doesn't require any physical strength. And yet, for some, I just see this equity happening more as a function of our needing less physical strength than and more mental strength than we have in the past.
I think that's really helpful, like generally. And then I think the other thing to add on is like we do often, and I wasn't trying to do anything earlier when I interjected, like I think sometimes we don't give fair service to the strength it takes even in the roles we have, right? I mean, there's this thing called emotional labor that most men have no idea how to do, and women are born to do emotional labor by their role. There's a book about it. It was written by a Delta Airlines flight attendant, right? Emotional labor means doing what you want, even though I know it's wrong and I have to smile and make you feel good about it. And I can tell you, my wife, who is extremely intelligent and hardworking, constantly has to do emotional labor as an attorney. When she's on a phone call with men, the men can just be right and they can say what they want, but she has to say the right answer in such a way she doesn't hurt their egos. And that's emotional labor. Clergy have to do emotional labor. Well, I don't know if we have to. There's a lot of emotional labor in being a cleric. We can choose to do it or not. And I get to see that because I do some of it. And look, I have to do less than frankly a woman in my position would have to do, because less is expected of me. But I will tell you what emotional labor seems to be like in the moments I've done it. It's like having a high power app on my phone that's running and drawing energy from the phone, and I can't turn it off. Like, it's just on all the time. So it just is constantly depleting your energy and resources and personhood. And I think the reason it's important to acknowledge this stuff is so that we can choose to empty ourselves of it.
Women also have to be careful about not being too direct, not having, putting forth their ideas or their plans directly. They have to work around it and present things in a way that's not threatening to the men in the group, and even sometimes manage to make it the man's idea.
That's right. And
that's emotional labor. That is hard.
And women aren't allowed to be angry. If they are, then there's something wrong with it, right? And so, like, these things are true then as now. And I do think, like, in some ways, the early proclamation of the gospel is there's freedom. And then how much freedom is there? Is there real freedom for us to escape social gender roles or not? And we've been grappling with that since the start. And the only way we live into that freedom is we empty ourselves, right? I mean, like, if I expect, I can say all the right stuff, but if I expect my wife or daughter to be like home cleaners because they're women, then you get it. And again, this is going to roll out in the early church, because the question is, like, at what point does the gospel become so radical that it's not palatable anymore? And that's an interesting question. And look, we're dealing with that now too, right? So, like, we deal with that as a school and a church level. Like, what about same-sex relationships? We know not everybody believes in those. And, like, how do we keep people who don't believe in them and also make a stand for what we think is right? What about history of race? Because right now that's a hot button issue, right? Like, hey, like, why are you trying to make us feel bad for something we didn't do? Like, that's how it gets sort of expressed out. And, like, what's the tension between losing people and also saying, like, there is indeed this history and weight and it's not right? We're all trying to figure this out. So in some ways, I'm not sure that we're in any different milieu than the early church is, if that makes sense. I don't think circumcision's an issue anymore because we don't go to public baths. And even if we did, so what, right? But there's other things that are issues. I mean, you've heard me say before, and it might sound small, right? But, like, the prayer book's not inclusive. It doesn't use inclusive gender. Maybe that doesn't matter to you personally, but it matters, and it's going to increasingly matter. And what do we do about it? Like, I know men and women alike who say, well, that's just how it's been, so why do we need to change it? Well, because it's wrong. That's why we need to change it, and because we can. It's inconvenient to change the way we talk. Of course it is. Of course it's inconvenient. It's also inconvenient to like live with somebody else because like they do stuff you don't want to do, but the alternative's not great. I've done the alternative. It's not great. So, well, thanks for gathering. Next week, we're on for lesson 29, and we're going to hear more about Corinth, which was an even more cosmopolitan city than Philippi. It was a shipping and commerce hub. So I'm looking forward to gathering with you on Corinth next week.